The scripture reading this morning is from Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 22 in a New Revised Standard Version. If another member of this church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you're not listened to, take one or two others along with you so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of two or three witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. If the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you, if two of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered in my name, I am among them. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times.
So for 5 Sundays and a few Sundays before that, we've been looking at Jesus' ministry through the eyes of his most trusted apostle, Peter. We've kind of poked fun at Peter a little bit in the last few weeks, haven't we? Because he's somebody who spoke his mind. And sometimes that was good, sometimes not so good. In the story of Jesus' transfiguration a few weeks ago, the gospel writer said that Peter made a comment because he did not know what to say. How often do we do that? We just say something because we don't know what to say, right? Last week, Peter tried to tell Jesus that he wasn't very happy with Jesus' plan to go to Jerusalem where he would be killed. And Jesus turned around and called him Satan and told him to get behind him. But as much as we want to roll our eyes at Peter's mistakes, we got to admit that we have all said and done something foolish as it relates to our trying to work our faith out, right? One thing that I can say about Peter's faith is that no matter the circumstances, he always remains tethered to God. Now, this week's text is another one of those passages that preachers either love to preach about or they would just rather sweep it under the rug and go on to something else. I'd love to jump right into the part that Gary read about Jesus telling Peter to forgive people 77 times, but this passage starts out with Jesus telling his disciples about what they should do if another member of the church sins against them. And he lays out a 3-step plan. Step 1 is that if a person sins against you, go talk to them one-on-one and tell him his fault. I like the part about talking to the person one-on-one, right? Don't drag anybody else into this. It's nobody else's business, so keep it within the two of you. What makes me cringe, though, is this phrase, tell him his fault. Because all I can think of is somebody saying, you know what's wrong with you, right? Because honestly, most of us can come up with at least a dozen examples of problems that we think a person has. But Jesus doesn't dwell on this very long. He doesn't go into the finer details about healthy communication and how one should avoid shaming and blaming and how it's better to use I feel statements rather than you are statements. But that leads to step 2. Step 2 is, if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Okay, let's pause here a minute and just let that soak in, okay? Might need take a deep breath, too, to get through this one. A member of the church has sinned against you. You go to that person to work it out, and that person does not listen. Maybe they casually brush you off. Maybe they tell you to go somewhere or to do something anatomically impossible. Jesus does not specify, but that's okay. You now have permission to bring 2 or 3 witnesses. You know who likes that? Church people. And please let me distinguish that church people doesn't mean people who attend church or people who belong to a church or people who are members of a church. That's different than church people, okay? There's a big difference between people who attend or belong to a church and church people. Yes, subtle difference in wording, but big difference when it comes to applying the term. Do you all know who I'm talking about, y'all? Remember Dana Carvey back in about 35 years ago or so? Church lady. Yep. Could it be Satan? That's who I'm talking about. That's who I'm talking about. See, church people are folks who love to play church games. And I'm not talking the games that we play down in the fireside room. I'm talking church games, okay? They relish the opportunity to gang up on someone to let them know what a sinner they are. Step 2 of this 3-step process becomes a license to open up full throttle and go full speed ahead in pointing out someone's sin. Heck, sometimes they even bypass step 1. Step 3 is where things get really interesting. Jesus says, if the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen, even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. This is where church people say, praise be to Jesus, so shall it be. Because not only do we get to tell it to the church, we get to treat this person like a Gentile or a tax collector. And this is taken to mean that they get to cast this person out of the assembly. Now, you know what they call this kind of exile in the South? It's not excommunication, that's too Catholic. Disfellowshipped? Yeah, that sounds a little less high church than excommunicate. But most people in the South call it getting churched. They'll say, well, did you hear that old Jack got churched for plowing his field on a Sunday? Yeah, the chair of the deacons visited him to tell him that it ain't right to work on the Sabbath, but he didn't listen. So then the chair of the elders, the board chair, and the pastor paid him a visit. Jack insisted that he didn't do anything wrong. He was plowing his field because he'd been sick and had to catch up on his work so he could feed his family. Well, they didn't think that that was a good excuse, and because he didn't repent, he got churched. Oh, come on, Pastor, you're exaggerating. No, I'm not. Church people love this kind of drama. They love showing how much holier than they are than anybody else. They love to point out people's sin. That is until somebody points out their sin and they get churched, right? Then people take sides and everybody gets all riled up. And then that's part of the game, because then there's people on one side and all the other side. And there's all this, how the Tasmanian devil used to go around like a little whirlwind? That's the way it would go through the church. Just everybody all riled up. So you know who else loves this passage? Pastors, who like to have something to hold over their congregation to make sure that they fall in line. It's all part of the game. But here is a revelation that is going to blow your mind. I know the first time I heard it, it blew my mind too. You ready for this? Okay. This phrase, "Let such a one be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector." That phrase right there. This phrase that most people think gives them the license to church somebody. Consider this. What was the biggest problem that the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the teachers of the law had with Jesus? What was the most frequent criticism that they threw at him? He eats with tax collectors and sinners. He eats and drinks with tax collectors and sinners. And he heals Gentiles. Sometimes on the Sabbath. He told parables about how the kingdom of heaven is for Jews and Gentiles alike. See where I'm going here? Yeah, but Jesus had to be operating on the understanding that Gentiles and tax collectors were persona non grata to good Jewish people who followed the law, right? Well, I think it's kind of funny how we humans always want to gravitate towards punishment. Well, Jesus doesn't want people getting away with sin. Jesus wants to punish sin. In fact, he has to punish sin. Therefore, so do we. Showing grace is the easy way out. It takes guts, takes fortitude to punish people. You know what? I don't think that's the more difficult path. Because honestly, for me, it is so much easier to want to punish somebody who I disagree with than to show grace. Give me the authority to back that up and tell me that I'm not going to get in trouble for it, and I will jump on that like a kid on a trampoline. What if, "Let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector" means, yeah, address the sin so it doesn't fester and cause problems, but keep inviting them to the table and love them anyway, just like Jesus does with the tax collectors and sinners. Sound good? Well, for me, that's the more difficult path. I don't want to punish people, but this right here is the more difficult path. But anyway, I just wanted to share that thought with you. Consider this a warm-up for the lesson that we're going to learn from Peter this morning, because we're supposed to be learning about Peter, right? And I'm off on this tangent about churching people and all that. But after hearing this illustration about what to do with people who won't listen to somebody when they point out their sin, Peter asks Jesus, "Lord, if a member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? What a thoughtful question, Peter. It doesn't look like we're going to get to have much fun teasing him this week, because he's just asking a clarifying question. Jesus just told folks what to do if a member of the church sins against them. Peter wants to know how often you are required to forgive a church member who sins against him. Well, first of all, let's talk about the word that gets translated as church. The Greek word is ecclesia. And by definition, it means an assembly of religious leaders, clerics, or priests. So consider this. The church as we know it today, here's the church, here's the steeple, and open the door, and there's all the people. That didn't exist when Jesus was in the midst of his earthly ministry, right? There was no church like we understand church today. But then we read a couple of weeks ago that Jesus told Peter that he was the rock on which his church, Jesus' church, would be built. Well, he was saying that Peter was going to be one of the founding leaders in the group of leaders who would carry out Jesus' ministry after his death and resurrection. It's hard for us to look at the word church and not think about what we understand as the church in the 21st century. So what Jesus is saying in the first part of this passage is, if anyone sins against a religious leader or a council of the leaders that is considered the church, here's what you do. Peter is asking, okay, but how often do I need to forgive a person who sins against me? And typically in Jewish law, that number is 3. But Peter's been hanging out with Jesus for a while, and he's kind of getting a pattern on what Jesus' answer is to some certain things. He knows that Jesus is going to say we need to go above and beyond what the law says, because he's all about forgiveness. He's learned this about Jesus. And so Peter comes up with a number. The number is 7. All right, 7 seems logical because it's a significant and holy number in the Jewish tradition, and it's 4 more than what is traditionally required. And Jesus says 7 times? No. I tell you more, 77 times. Now, for those of you who memorized this in the King James, what is typically the translation? 70 times 7. Yep. And this is where church people pull out their calculators and say, okay, 7 is 490. And then they'll start making a ledger of, how many times people sin against them. And then they can say, this is it. I've reached 490. It's time for me to stop. Or I've reached 77. Some people like this translation, the 77, better, because that's way less than 490. Jesus' answer to Peter's question does not mean literally the number 77 or 490. Jesus' answer emphasized the abundance of forgiveness. The number isn't important. It isn't about the math. That's not what the story is about. This story shows the importance of asking questions and expanding our faith. It's about being okay with not having definitive answers and formulas. It's about not having a rule book for church formulas and church games. It's about not making rules for those games. Jesus is encouraging us to see the world in a more nuanced way. Jesus' response to Peter's question about forgiveness highlights the ambiguous math of grace. Peter learns about abundant grace. It's about letting go of rigid limits and embracing the limitless possibilities of forgiveness, where one act of faith can lead to forgiveness and transformation. Jesus' teachings remind us of the power of forgiveness to make the community whole. Peter's encounter with Jesus reminds us of the profound lessons embedded in forgiveness. Forgiveness is a boundless wellspring of grace. Repair is vital both within ourselves and with our relationship with others. This story encourages us to embrace that transformative power of forgiveness and work towards reconciliation and healing. It inspires us to open ourselves to the expansive grace of God. And by doing so, we can create a world where forgiveness mends what is broken, and where the beauty of repair shines through and illuminates our shared humanity.